Hello, this is Cheryl Marlene. Welcome to Spiritual Deep Dive. In this episode, we hear from the Akashic Records during our weekly Akashic Record Insights workshop. The topic of this conversation is all about the Akashic Records and soul cases. We dive deep into the nature of learning truth within the Akashic Records, especially related to cold cases, which takes us in to the depths of understanding what the Akashic Records are and what they can be. The question that got us started is this. So if you were looking at a cold case, a murder case from the past, for example, would you ever get to the absolute truth of it if there is such a thing? Or would it just be a matter of perspective?
So if you were looking at a cold case, a murder case from the past, would you ever get to the absolute truth of it, if there is such a thing? Or would it just be a matter of perspective?
So if you go looking for cold cases and you're doing that work within the Akashic Records, part of it kind of depends on the cold case. And it kind of depends, well, it depends actually a lot on what question you're trying to get answered and how those two things blend together. Because there's a difference between asking, there can be a difference between who murdered this person versus who does this person think murdered them, depending on what the context is. And so when you go looking at cold cases or you go looking at past events to try to understand them, you need to, first of all, be really aware of what question you're asking, and or what answer you are seeking. Because depending on the context, you may not be able to get an eye view, let's say, of the event. And you may not even be able to get an eye view of the event that actually shows you what happened. And there also may be interference from, say if it's a cold case about someone being murdered, for example, the person who was murdered may have created energy at the time that you can't get through to see who did it. Or there can be energy afterwards that clouds it as well. And so in order to be able to answer any question definitively, you have to be, you've got to be clear in the questions you ask and what it is that you want to know to start with. Being asked to look at a cold case by someone who is, let's say, emotionally attached to the case will probably make it easier for you to get closer to what happened. Whereas, like, if we just all say, let's go figure out who Jack the Ripper is, yeah, it's not, if, at least theoretically, that's not actually impossible. It's just that, say if it was me, I'm at a very distant remove there in terms of my interaction or my connection with whoever that was and whatever it is that they did, right? Like, I'm not aware of, I have a relative that was killed by Jack the Ripper or something like that. But that's to say that when you're trying to find out definitively about what happened in a past event, the closer you are, let's just say emotionally, to that event, the easier and to some extent, the easier it is to get validation. But you can also be too close to be the one that does it, right? If your parent was killed when you were a child, it would probably be better for you to ask someone to do that in the records for you than you try to do it yourself, because you're too emotionally attached, close to that person. Whereas if you ask somebody that can do that kind of work, you're giving them some energetic motion there, because everything comes out of the Akashic Records through intention. And so the clearer you are about the intention related to a closed case, the more likely you're going to get to something that shows up as the answer to the question. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So if your intention is to like solve the murder, to find an answer, you'll get an answer, but it won't necessarily be the complete answer.
That's true. That's very possible.
Mm.
Or it can be the answer from a particular perspective. Like, say if you're trying to find out, you know, like who shot somebody in a crowd of people. Each person in that crowd could have a slightly different perspective on it that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to actually be able to pinpoint the person that did the shooting. But the thing about that is that if you do the work in the records and you get different perspectives, it's possible to put those perspectives together that allows you to identify who the person is, right? Even, you know, because it, you know, like they're saying, you know, like it's very stereotypical, right? Like if, you know, if 10 people are standing and watching one person get shot, each of those 10 people has a different recounting of what happened, right? So the way to do it is in the records. I mean, and I imagine this is what forensic science is about, but it is that you're putting that all together in such a way that it's like, how can all of this be true? Right. And then part of it is just, you know, like something with a murder, there's a certain amount of that physically has to be in a certain way, right? Like, right. So like if the bullet, you know, if the trajectory of the bullet is, you know, like from the shoulder down into the body, then that means that that gun has to be higher up and it can't be lower down, right? So the laws of physics still stand. But it's why in a lot of ways, this is funny, in a lot of ways doing cold cases in the records is very much like being Sherlock Holmes, right? If you get rid of the impossible, then however improbable, what's left is the truth. And that's why it ends up being somewhat difficult, because there may be a part of you that wants to reject it because it seems so improbable. But part of the reason why a cold case is a cold case is because typically there's something there that seems improbable for most people, and that's what's hanging it up. So if you use the records and there's several different things you can do, different ways you can do that, but you can use the Akashic Records to work through both the possibilities and the improbabilities to weave together essentially at least in a narrative that would strike most people as valid.
So like in the case of the Titanic, the guy who was supposed to spot the iceberg forgot his binoculars, and that's why it sank.
Yeah, that can be
one reason.
Yeah, I mean, it can kind of come down to that. Exactly, which is something that people, you know, a whole lot of people just don't want to hear that. Or, you know, or it can sound so simple as to not be probable. You know, it's like, you know, whatever. Whoever was supposed to be doing it got sick from dinner and went to the bathroom, and boom, right? Yeah, I mean, but that's part of the problem of looking at events like that in the past, is because the other part of the problem is that you're looking at it with current eyes on the past. So that means that there's things that you know that wouldn't have been knowable or known at that point in time. And so your lens, you have to really work at making sure that the lens that you're looking at through the records is much more of the present of the past rather than the present of the present. So it means that as you go back further in the history, it can get more difficult for people to look in the records or even to just do regular remote viewing, because their perspective of it has the hue of the present, right? Like, we're all used to cell phones, right? So if we go back 500 years and communication didn't use cell phones, then we may not understand how they communicated, which is really interesting because, they've said this before that, like 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, approximately, maybe more, maybe less, is when human communication started. I mean, verbal speech. And that before that, we used telepathy, or what we would call telepathy. So if you go back, I don't know, let's say 15,000 years ago to figure out something, you're looking at an interaction within human beings that would be alien to you. And so, I mean, and it's the whole problem of history. It's the whole problem of, like, say, anthropology or sociology or any of those perspectives, is because we don't always know how our vision is colored when we look at something that's beyond, let's say, our historic reference, right? Like we have, like, trying to explain how the pyramids is built is exactly that problem.
Why is it that we can't go to the records and actually get, for example, the cold case, get the answer? And I know we just talked about the perspectives. I understand everything that you just said, but the records know everything.
Well, the records are dynamic, and they may contain everything, and to a certain extent, they may know everything, but their perspective is different than our perspective. And so it has to do with the fact that there's almost never one answer to a question.
But if someone is murdered and the person killed them by shooting them, there's only one person that shot the gun.
That's true. But it has a lot to do with the perspective. I mean, if you're able to open the records of the killer, you get a different perspective of the event than, say, you open up the records of the person who was killed. And all of that assumes that you have permission to do so, which isn't usually the case. So if you're going to use the records to do that, what you have to do is there's ways you can get permission. You can do it that way. Or you look in the records it's a particular, there's several different techniques that you can use, but it's basically looking at the event from the perspective of the fly on the wall.
Yeah.
A third person perspective of some kind.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see exactly what happened. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Just like, even if you open up the records of the person that was killed, doesn't necessarily mean they know who killed them. Because if you open up the records of the dead person, you're opening up the records of that soul in that body.
Right.
Which is different than opening up the records of the soul. And so the soul in that body may not know who killed him.
Can you say the last thing you just said? The soul in that body
might not know who killed the body.
The soul in that body, the one that crossed over, may not know who killed the body.
That's right.
So there is no omniscience then. Once you cross over, you're in a delusion of what killed you. I would say we have a review and we are like, that motherfucker killed me. Just saying.
Well, here's the thing. What I'm getting out of the records right now about that is not all souls care to know.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah. I mean, we might think that that's the way it is, but what they're saying is that that's not necessarily how it always goes down. And because it might be that the person wanted to be killed. And so whoever did it, they don't care. It happened. They're good. They're gone. They're moving on, right? Like in other words, because see, part of it is like in the case of a murder, there's in reality, in real life, what happened. At the same time, there's what happened to the souls in those bodies. And once the soul leaves the body, it's the soul that is controlling, let's say, awareness. And the whole reason why the murder might happen in real life has a very different play out than what that experience was for the soul. For example, they're saying, the soul could have decided at some point, I mean, in the moment or eons ago, it doesn't really matter from the soul's perspective, to give the other soul the experience of killing somebody, right? I mean, in other words, there's the, like what we would think of as the reason why has infinitely more perspectives than we actually could think about when we start thinking about it from the soul's perspective. So if we go into the records and we ask the question, like who killed JFK? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's ways that you can get answers to that. You get perspectives to that. But there's also a way in which you're going to get way more than you ever bargained for.
So basically the records are a collection, if I'm understanding this right, of the perspectives of the people involved, and it has the event itself, but because reality is dynamic, there is no absolute truth.
Yeah, that's okay. A good way. Yeah, that's a good way to say it, because essentially the records are written in the moment, quote unquote. Like if we're going to use the book and library motif here, the records are written in the moment of asking, because they're holding the infinite and the eternal perspective, which means that in any moment, it's not just like, say, my perspective. It's the interactive experience of the infinite and the eternal within me. And it's what is going to help. So when I go into the records and I ask a question, the answer comes to me, not as any sense of that's the only one answer. It's what needs to be heard in this moment for me to take my next step. So when you're using the records for something like a cold case, that's why questions end up being so important, is because drawing out that answer is it's more complex, because you're dealing with it, because you're, in a certain sense, what you're doing is you're leaving real life right now and going to real life back then, which is still connected infinitely and eternally. So, and part of it all, right? It's like, we get into this, like this is an interesting concept. Also, like if we attach it to past lives, mm-hmm. Like this would be the same thing. I mean, because theoretically, all that information is there, but mm-hmm. that's also a linear perspective of the way the energy is held. Right. And part of the problem is that from the dynamic perspective, from the perspective of the transcendent, it's not just it's not a linear chronology that's there. Mm-hmm. It is a chronology essentially of the infinite and the eternal experience, let's say, of a soul, right? So it's not just my soul's experience on earth, but it's my soul's experience within the infinite and the eternal, which means that, and then if you add into that isn't governed by linear time, right? It's no longer this straight line. What you're dealing with is the soul is, like, the way I look at it is the soul's in the middle of the sphere, and any question you have about past lives comes from 360 degrees as opposed to one.
Ooh, okay, you're getting way.
Yeah, but then if you think about that sphere, that's just that in this moment, and that every moment of experience that a soul has creates another connected sphere. So you're like it's 360 degrees times infinity, basically. And so when you then are trying to make your way through all of that energy to try to find the answer to a question in a particular moment of linear time, you got a problem. And it's not that you can't get those kinds of answers, because I have. And even it's not impossible to look to the future to get those kinds of answers, right? Like, because I've had those, like I do that as well. But it's all ends up being about how can you validate the answer that you get.
Right.
Right. And that's part of the problem is that, yeah, you can go back and you can ask about, whoever killed whoever, and you can get a really good answer, and it may feel truthful to you, but it might not be anything that you can validate to the rest of the world in such a way that people would believe that you actually got that as an answer. And then you add conspiracy theory on top of that, and now you really got an issue. Which is why I've never written a book, Who was Jack the Ripper, right? Like, because there's no way in the world that I'm ever going to be able to validate that. Maybe I can. Maybe I'm saying that that's impossible when actually it is possible. But you see what the complication of all of this is, right? And that's why historically people have wanted to say the Akashic Records were a book in a library so that we could definitively answer questions.
Okay.
Woo. And then that ends up being the problem of why when I insist that it's not a book in a library, we got a problem, because it's asking everybody to deal with the crazy that just came out of my mouth.
Yes. Okay. The crazy that comes out of the records sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Spiritual Deep Dive. For more, visit spiritualdeepdive.com or my website, cherylmarlene.com. To join our weekly Akashic Record Insights workshop, go to akashicrecordinsights.com.